Ellen White Reconsidered, a series of presentations for people with questions about Ellen White and her writings. Today's presentation is A Corrected Defense of Ellen White's Gift. Hi, I just tuned in to SDA Q&A, and there's a program going on there discussing the book Reclaiming Ellen White. And since I've been aware of the book and corresponded with Ron Grable about it because he wanted my input, knowing that I had done quite a bit of research on Ellen White and would be aware of some things that maybe some of the authors wouldn't see, he sent me a copy of the manuscript. I have that copy. Others have access to it on, on archive.org. It's available, so people can read the book. And uh, there are some things there that I think are recommendable. There are things in the book that give some light, shed some light. Although sometimes it is more of a reflection of the thinking of the scholar rather than having it backed up by good, solid evidence in primary sources. So I'm going to take that manuscript and I'm going to go through a few of the corrections or suggestions that I sent. In another video, I believe I've already talked about that I submitted a whole another chapter that is a real big gaping hole in the coverage of her, in reclaiming her as a prophet, and saying that it should be an honest view. It needs to also deal with those things that make the historian a little uncomfortable, even though there's good evidence for it. All right, so let's take a look. Written by Terry Dopp Ahmed. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the last name correctly, but looks like it's on page 17. And it's just a minor note, but it said here, talking about in 1845, when Ellen White began traveling, her mother sent a letter asking her to come home. And this is a viewpoint issue that I called attention to. Her calling was so strong that in early 1845, this usually obedient teenager resisted her mother's instruction to return home and stop embarrassing the family. And my note here is that actually it was her mother's concern for her daughter's reputation. So, yeah, you could slant it to say it's reflecting on the family, but here it actually is her concern for her daughter's reputation, and that's the only evidence we have is Ellen White's own statement, and that's how she framed it. Okay, another matter here in this chapter. This is just one of those kinds of things that a historian may get wrong, and because they made an assumption. During their teenage years, as they explored Millerite beliefs, she and Robert is the uh, brother of Ellen, just a little bit older, were spiritual soulmates. And that part's true. And after the great disappointment, he sometimes accompanied her during her travels. And that struck me because I had reconstructed that first year. And though she did travel with one of her sisters, Robert did not. And Ron asked me to back that up. So I found here the statement. She wrote that he most surely did not travel with her. My brother Robert, but 2 years older than myself, could not accompany me, for he was feeble in health, and his timidity greater than mine. Nothing could have induced him to take such a step. So clearly, this is just a minor point, but needed correcting. We continue on down, and here's another one that I marked. Sentence begins: as an uncertain young woman in her mid-20s, Ellen experienced puzzlement and likely frustration as James, who was concerned that her visions could create the wrong impression for outsiders, began to exclude written accounts about them from the pages of the review in 1850, a banishment that would end only when Uriah Smith took over editorship of the paper in 1855. Well, that's a general statement that's generally correct, although he did produce in 1851 an extra that did include her visions. And in my book, Glory, 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 I show that there are some exchanges even before 1855. And the notion here, it seems like, is that he backpedaled on the gift, where in reality it just took a different direction, because with that 1851 extra, they were also they also used the typesetting to produce her first book, which I just recently showed you that I have in my library now and own it. And then in 1854, there had been some supplements, and she added some other visions there. So although not in the form of the Review and Herald, those that wanted her visions could purchase them as a book and a supplement. And then in 1855, a new course began, because it was in 1855 that the Battle Creek Church voted to have a testimony that she sent to them published. And that began this whole new approach of publishing testimonies as pamphlets, and then they'd be gathered together in a book or in a volume. And that's how they were published. From there on out, although the latter ones were written specifically for the testimonies, not sent first as little pamphlets. So that's a minor difference back, but that's later in as the time goes on. Would issues like that be sufficient to hold off publication? No, I don't think so. We'll get to some other ones here in just a second. Okay, here was just a minor issue. It says she struggled in her marital relationship to James, but freely doled out marriage advice, which makes it seem like she was a hypocrite. But that's not the point. I mean, marriages have issues, and theirs did, particularly because of the ravages of his having had strokes, which made his temperament even more forceful. And they worked it out. And by the time they were working together, just shortly before he passed away, they had resolved those issues. So rather than this making her look like a hypocrite, actually, I think it gives some strength to what she was achieving. All right. One more thing down here as I go down to the next one here. This is more of a major issue. Thinking of the testimonies as one kind of writing, the conflict of the ages as another, can help us understand what is generally considered Ellen White's most gaping vulnerability, the inspired writer who borrowed, in fact, plagiarized so generously from other writers. And I think there's a little bit of apocryphal nature of how much she actually borrowed. Um, And so I made this note. He fails to define plagiarized when the innovative and improved use of thoughts and words of others was not considered plagiarism by most. Plagiarism means robbery of the thoughts and words of others, claiming them to be one's own. Whereas she uses a little thought gem here or there and reframes it, sets it in a new place to make a point. That might, by some grand technicality, be considered plagiarism, but within that day and usage, it was not. And if we analyze how it's used, and those who present the parallels online, like Testing the Prophet, he just marks whole paragraphs so that you think, oh, she borrowed lots and lots of material from others. He's using, when he does show those are exceptional areas where she has borrowed more. And he doesn't distinguish. He doesn't show how it's adapted. He doesn't show how it's part of her thought process that she has adapted language. And I think that overgeneralizes the notion of what is plagiary. And then to use the word so generously, when at this point, where we're looking at specifics in her usage of specific wording from other authors, it doesn't even come up to 4%, not the 70, 80% that somebody imagined. And so accepting this as a given without recognizing what it actually is, even the 31% that came from Veltman's study, it was saying that 31% echoed or was similar in thought to others, not ascertaining that it was actually taken from another. And I think if it were carefully examined, one could see that a lot of those things are just telling the story of the Bible. And of course, it's going to be the same. And the unique statements are thought gems that pop up here and there. And I've noted in the first chapter, A Desire of Ages, that it had the most in that chapter of similar thought gems, adapted thought gems. And other chapters, you just find one or two, maybe just one. And others are scattered words here and there, telling the same story. So I think that overblows it. And this generously, he needs to quantify what he means by generously, because readers are likely to assume that Ellen White used 70 to 90% from others, a range that was floated by Ray and by those who repeated his guesstimation, rather than the documented 4 to 5% that now exists in Tim Poyer's Project Surprise. So that part was from Jonathan Butler's contribution, his chapter. And I'm not sure that he has looked very carefully at that issue. Let's look at some others. This one is in the same chapter by Butler, and it's relating to the Stewart Blue Book. That was the color of the original uh, thing. And you see where he calls it the Blue Book. Ellen White wrote an open letter to those who are perplexed regarding the testimonies relating to the medical missionary work. Okay, I had not really had much background in this, and I was able to get a copy of the Blue Book and its issues and read through it. And one of the things that surprised me about the Blue Book was that while she was asking about concerns about the medical missionary work, that was what she was soliciting. He gave a laundry list of many, many other things. So, what was she supposed to do with all of those other things? She had asked for a narrowly focused query, and he went into many other things. So, that's the first thing that I noted. Doesn't really change the text of the book. That shouldn't be a matter. Um, but then we go down here to this issue. Again, coming back to plagiarism. Indeed, little of the conflict series seems to have been rooted in the prophet's visions, while much of it can be traced to the writings of others. In time, the pejorative term plagiarism was appropriately applied to her literary practice, and probably in all fairness. Now, that's a sweeping statement. He has stated publicly that he wants to just accept at face value the notion that she plagiarized. And I think that a much more nuanced position should be taken to look at the historical ambience. If we go back to 1850, we find a different standard for even quoting without attribution. Quoting without attribution was common, particularly in sermons, pamphlets, and religious or political writing. Writers often adapted or paraphrased earlier works without explicit credit, especially when the adapted text was placed into a new context or had a didactic or religious purpose. Then, if we move on down 40 years to 1890, we find a tightening of the expectation of academic attribution. However, writers often adapted the ideas or even the phrasing of others without formal citation, particularly when the borrowed material came from classical, religious, or public domain sources. The new work made a distinct original point, or the author was not claiming novelty, but rather illustrating or moralizing. Then, here by 1890, adapting, say, three sentences from another work into a new context might raise eyebrows if the borrowing was close to verbatim and unattributed, particularly in scholarly and literary circles. But if the adaptation changed the wording and the meaning sufficiently, it would not typically be considered plagiarism, especially outside of academia. Butler's going to talk some more about her use of other authors. Okay, I want to look at a couple of phrases here in this section. He considers that because of her wider reading, that her writing, such as in the conflict series, became to a considerable degree anthologies of her reading. And I believe that takes it too far. This characterization trivializes her own focus and contributions and unique eyewitness details. If you want to understand how tortured the effort is to come up with energetic and entertaining prose, which was not her object, watch the movie Genius about the career of American novelist Thomas Wolfe. Originality in writing drives writers almost crazy. And her intent was something else. Let's take a look here at the next paragraph down below. Let me raise this up a little bit. In the 1880s, two books served as lightning rods of plagiarism charge against Ellen White. One of them was Sketches from the Life of Paul. It was not a matter of accusation of plagiarism in the 1880s. So I don't know what he's saying. This is actually a later statement in the 1919 and with this blue book looking backwards. It was not in the 1880s. And we see here, he says, one of them was the Sketches from the Life of Paul, in which he drew heavily upon Conybeare and Hausen's book of 20 years earlier. Okay, let's take a look at what I'm my comments. When it comes to this book on the Sketches from the Life of Paul, she says in the very outset that her intent, what was unique, was applying this period, not coming up with new facts, not new stories that aren't in the Bible. She's going to cover the same Bible stories. So she used a book that she recommended over and over again and that was already selling through the Review and Herald and being given as a premium for new subscribers to the Signs of the Times. It was almost a saturation of the market, but they wanted her unique focus. And so she tells some of the same stories. And yes, she follows the same order as they do in telling the story, but her focus is on applying the period. And that spiritual application is not from Coney Barrenhausen. In fact, Conybeare really doesn't figure into it because Conybeare's part was to translate the New Testament text in a novel translation. Hausen was the one who was commenting on the history. She does borrow some. When I read the initial description of her use of Conybeare and Hausen, I assumed that she was just going to condense Coney Barrenhausen, that it would be a totally derivative work. And when I began my exhaustive study of this, which is online, available at academia.edu, you can see exactly what she borrows. You can see the few scattered words here and there, and you can see little tighter thought gems occasionally. It is even as high a percentage as it is compared to, say, early writings, it's not like what I thought it was going to be because she is taking the story and making the spiritual applications for the church. And that's what she had been asked to do in writing this history. And most of those insights are still carried over into Acts of the Apostles in 1911. So the hullabaloo about plagiarism at the time that it came out is rewriting history. Now we're going to look at some issues in Gilbert Valentin's chapter. The implication in this case, let me zoom it up a little bit so you can see it, is that she was engaged in fanaticism. Okay, so here's a sentence. Did she also perhaps recall her own difficult and ambiguous involvement in the early religious enthusiasm, getting caught up in it and then opposing it? Okay, here's my note, and I'm just going to read it. She outlined in her autobiographical account what she considered fanatical, and she did not engage in that which she considered fanatical, the writer's concept of fanaticism notwithstanding. In the testimony section of Volume 2 of Spiritual Gifts are witness statements regarding her not engaging in fanaticism. In view of the slanderous reports were circulated by a few individuals against Brother and Sister White, we feel called upon to testify that we have been personally acquainted with them in their course since 1844, and therefore know that any statements that would represent them as being in any wise connected with or countenancing in any degree those fanatical abominations into which some in Maine and elsewhere were drawn during the years 1844 to 1846 are wicked and malicious falsehoods. We have never known them to be in the least infected with the spirit or works of fanaticism, but on the contrary, as the untiring and unflinching opposers of the same. Vigorous amens and even hallelujahs are not fanatical. We see it practiced in many churches, many Adventist churches today. Culturally, it's acceptable in many of our churches. And the foot washing, we as Adventists still practice. That was considered fanatical in that day. Another matter that may not be as culturally astute is Peter and Paul's recommendation of greeting one another with the holy kiss. That was a greeting. Of course, in some cultures, they still give air kisses as they greet someone or a hug. The hugs that we do today probably would have been risque in that time. But these are not fanatical things. So I think there's a little bit of a slant on the presentation here. And I think what is the greater issue is what I mentioned in my other video, and that is what is entirely omitted. And that is the prescience that she had to know things before she was advised, before others could tell her, things that she saw in vision that she applied. And there is some puzzlement as to how she applied it because she was shown a vision. How is she supposed to know how to apply it? And so there were some times when people would say, well, what do you mean by this? And she could say, well, that's what I was shown. And this is something you need to take to God personally. So obviously, she doesn't know everything. The gift of prophecy is not the gift of omniscience. The balance is missing about the supernatural in her visions, her public visions. maybe because that's embarrassing to some people. But the evidence is actually there that these things actually took place. Numerous eyewitnesses reported it. They were physicians present to examine her. How could somebody go 10 minutes without breathing? How could somebody go an hour and a half without breathing, or at least any perceptive breathing? Those are things that I could not explain. But the evidence is there that it actually took place, and that's missing. And I think that when we paint just one side, it does not give a proper representation. And when I suggested this to some of the historians in the church, one that I won't identify said, "Well, we've heard those stories for years." Yeah, but they've been validated. I validated them in this book. They're still true. Well, that's the corrected view. Thanks for stopping by.